Yo guys, Jin here. This is yet another ball lightning build to go with the thousands of them out there already. So what makes this one any different, you might ask? Well, it uses the Fireball enchantment. This build was basically made with the sole purpose of speeding through nightmare dungeons and collecting Helltide cinders. And of course has the added bonus of mowing down bosses incredibly fast. At the end of the video there will be some full nightmare dungeon runs to show how this build typically looks in action. And if you do enjoy the video, please leave a like and subscribe as it helps a bunch. And without further ado, let's get into the build. Starting with the skill tree, we're going to put 2 into any of these basic skills. We're not going to use them at all. So then we come down to our core skills. We're going to put 5 into Fireball, 1 into Devastation, 3 into Elemental Dominance, and then Chain Lightning, 1 point, into Destructive Chain Lightning. So then we're going to come down to defensive skills. We're going to take Flame Shield, 1 point, and then Mystical Flame Shield. Then we're going to put 1 point into Teleport, and then go for the Shimmering Teleport. Then we're going to grab 3 into Glass Cannon for that extra damage, and 1 into Elemental Attunement. Then we're going to go for 1 in Ice Armor, and then Mystical Ice Armor. Then 1 into Frost Nova, and then Mystical Frost Nova. Basically all the mystical stuff, except for Teleport, which we want Shimmering. Then we come down here to our Conjuration skills, and we're going to put 1 into Align the Elements, just so we can get to the 3 in Mana Shield. So this is 21% damage reduction for 5 seconds every time we spend 100 mana. So once you start fighting, that is basically always active, which is really important. And then we're going to get 3 into Protection, so using a cooldown grants 30% of our maximum life as a barrier for 3 seconds. So also really important there. Then we'll come down to our Mastery skills, and we're going to whack 5 into Ball Lightning, and then go for Wizard's Ball Lightning. And then 1 into Static Discharge, so we can get the 3 in Invigorating Conduit. So this helps a lot with our mana generation here. Then coming down to our ultimate skills, we're going to get 1 into Unstable Currents and all the subsequent nodes. Then 1 into Coursing Currents, 3 into Electrocution, 2 into Conduction, and then for our key passive, we're going to take Esu's Ferocity. So this is bugged at the moment, and it works for all elemental damage, I believe, instead of just fire. So that is the skill tree. It's pretty straightforward. Very similar, I'm assuming, to most ball lightning builds, besides the points into Fireball, which they would usually be in either Ice Blades or the Conjuration Mastery, and maybe more points into Teleport. So let's move on to the Paragon board now. I optimized this slightly more than my last board, so we have a few more points to play with. We'll start with the starting board. Of course, we have the Charged Glyph. That's going to give us Crackling Energy damage. Then for the second board, the Enchantment Master board, we're going to put in the Tactician Glyph here. So that's going to give us bonus to ray nodes within range. And in this case, that will be the non-physical damage, as well as the resistance to elements. Then for our third board, we're going to have the Ceaseless Conduit board. And we're going to put in the Exploit Glyph here for all that extra vulnerable damage. And we're going to pick up the Hunter Killer rare node as well for the damage to elites and movement speed. Then we're going to come up to our fourth board, which is the Frigid Fate board, and we're going to put the Adept Glyph in here. So that's going to give us a lot of Mastery skill damage. I'm not really sure if the Mastery skills have 20% increased area applies to Ball Lightning, but nonetheless we get the Mastery skill damage. And we're going to pick up the Oppressive rare node for even more vulnerable damage and some extra damage reduction from vulnerable enemies, as well as picking up these vulnerable damage nodes as well. For our fifth board, it's going to be the Burning Instinct board, and we're going to put in the Destruction Glyph here, so we're going to get a lot of critical strike damage from this glyph. And we're going to make sure we pick up the Safeguard rare node as well, just for the extra armor and damage reduction from elites. Then we're going to go down to our 6th board, and this is going to be the Searing Heat board. We're going to put the control glyph in here for damage to crowd-controlled enemies. We also deal increased damage to slowed or chilled enemies, and even more to stunned or frozen enemies. So then our 7th and final board, we're going to have the Static Surge board. So this node is very important, as it's going to be our main source of vulnerable proccing. So after spending a certain amount of mana, our next cast of Chain Lightning makes enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds and restores 10% of our mana. So very, very important to get this node here. And as for the glyph, we're going to put in the Territorial glyph just to get some extra damage to close enemies and a good amount of damage reduction against close enemies. All of it is going to be in the build planner, which I will link in the description below. So check that out to make sure you get all of the nodes that I got. So moving on to the enchantments now. So pretty straightforward, we're going to go for the Chain Lightning enchantment, and that will also give us the Chain Lightning Critical Strike, has a 30% chance to form a Crackling Energy. So we're going to get a lot of Crackling Energy out of this, as well as proccing the Vulnerable. So very, very good synergy here with this. And then for our other enchantment, we're going to be putting the Fireball enchantment in here. So when we kill an enemy, they explode in a fireball for 50% of the damage, which in my case will be about 12,000-13,000 damage. So when all of those enemies are blowing up, that is hundreds of thousands of damage coming just from this enchantment. Before we get to the gear, I'll just talk about the Vampiric powers that we're going to use. So we're going to need 8 packs of Ferocity, 3 packs of Divinity, and 3 packs of Eternity. So we're going to use Prey on the Weak. That gives us extra 16% increased damage to vulnerable enemies, multiplicative. Then we're going to take Metamorphosis. So when we evade, we turn into a cloud of bats and become unstoppable. This synergizes well with our gear as well, which you will see shortly. Then we're going to grab Ravenous. So, like a hit, up to 20% chance to increase our attack speed by 40% of our total movement speed for 6 seconds, which is quite a long time. Then we're going to put Domination in the 4th slot. So we deal 24% increased damage to enemies that are stunned, immobilized, frozen, or feared. And if they're injured and not an elite, they will die instantly, which is great. Procs our Fireball enchantment really well as well. And then for the last Vampiric power, we're going to put in the Sanguine Brace power. So when we kill an enemy, we fortify for 6% of our base life. So while you have more fortify than half of your max life, you gain 8% critical strike chance. So this is really, really solid. Basically makes us a lot more tanky than we would be otherwise, and gives us more critical strike chance, which is always good. So that's it for that. Pretty straightforward. Now let's get to the gear. So for the gear, on the left I will list the affixes from best to worst that I think you should get on each piece. And let's start with the helm. For the helm you want to get total armor percent, cooldown reduction, max life, and all stats. If you can't get those, then you would want to look for intelligence, crowd control duration, life on kill, or barrier generation. So for the aspect, we're going to put in the ever-living aspect. So that'll give us 25% less damage from crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies. One extra note about the helm, if you are doing boss rotations or overworld content, you don't actually need the ever-living aspect, so you could easily swap to a Godslayer's. This is just a huge increase in damage. As you can see, we get an extra 21% damage in my case, as well as getting an awesome unique aspect. Next up, we have the chest piece, and we're going to want to go for total armor percent, damage reduction from close, damage reduction from distant, and max life. If you can't get that, then you would want to look for damage reduction, all stats, or intelligence. As for the aspect, we're going to put on disobedience. So we gain 1.1% increased armor for 4 seconds when we deal any form of damage. This build deals an incredible amount of instances of damage, so it's almost always stacked up pretty much immediately. So that is a huge, huge chunk of armor right there. Next up, the gloves. You're going to want to get critical hit chance, attack speed, critical hit chance against injured, and all stats. If you can't get that, then look for intelligence, ranks into fireball, or ranks into chain lightning. As for the aspect, we're going to be using the Stormswell aspect, so we deal 27% in my case, increased damage to vulnerable enemies while we have a barrier. So that synergizes well with our skill tree. Next up, we have the legs, or pants, and we're going to want to get Tybalt's Will here. So this is definitely the best in the slot. It gives you an insane amount of damage, gives you some potion capacity, some maximum resource, some damage reduction from close, and an insane unique passive, so we will deal 40% in my case, increased damage while unstoppable, and for 4 seconds after. And when we become unstoppable, gain 50 of our primary resource. So with the Vampiric power that makes us unstoppable when we evade, this is basically almost always on, so incredible amount of damage there. If you don't happen to have Tybalt's Will, then you would want to look for leggings with total armor percent, damage reduction from close, damage reduction from distant, and ranks into ball lightning. And if you can't get those, then you would look for damage reduction, max life, all stats, or intelligence. So let's move on to the boots now. We have Esu's Heirloom. I think this is slightly better than Flickerstep and Penitent Greaves for the critical strike damage, and the unique aspect, which is our critical strike chance is increased by 20 to 30% of our movement speed bonus. Now if you don't have either of the 3 unique boots, then you would look for boots with movement speed percent, mana cost reduction, all stats, and ranks into teleport. If you can't get those, then you would go for intelligence, and maybe something like dodge percent, or maybe damage reduction when injured. And as for the aspect, you would want to use something like Ghost Walkers, so while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after, you gain 10 to 25% increased movement speed and can move freely through enemies. Or also something like Banding Conduit, but that is not as good as Ghost Walkers in my opinion. So next up we have the Amulet. So for the Amulet we're going to want to get ranks into Glass Cannon, ranks into Mastery Skills, total armor percent, and intelligence percent. If you can't get those, then go for cooldown reduction percent, damage percent, or mana cost reduction. So for the aspect, we're going to use the gravitational aspect, so that will let our ball lightning orbit around us and deal 38%, in my case, increased damage. So we put that on the amulet because it gets the 1.5 times bonus. Next up, we have the rings. So for our main ring, we're going to want Talrash's Iridescent Loop. That gives us a huge amount of non-physical damage, some resource generation, cooldown reduction, and lucky hit chance, which is nice to have, I guess. As well as giving us an awesome unique aspect. For each type of elemental damage we deal, we gain 11% in my case, increased damage for 4 seconds. So really good ring here. And it's not too difficult to get, just do a bunch of Varshans and you should get a few of them, no problem. So for our other ring, we're going to want to get something with critical strike chance, vulnerable damage, close damage, and resource generation. If you can't get those, then you would go for max life and crit damage. Now, as for the aspect, we are using Ancient Flame, which is, while we have both bonuses from S's Ferocity key passive, our attack speed is increased by 40 to 50%. Now, if you're having mana issues, then you would definitely want to use the recharging aspect instead, which is each time Chain Lightning bounces, gain 1.5 to 3 mana. So next up, we have the weapon. Now, for the main hand weapon, you have 2 options, but firstly, you're looking for max or as close to max item power as possible for the high base damage. So, you either want a dagger for the built-in close damage, and the affixes you'll look for are all stats, mastery skill damage, vulnerable skill damage, and damage to close. If you can't find those, then critical strike damage or intelligence are good as well. And for the aspect, you're going to be using Ancient's Flame here. And then of course you would have recharging on the ring instead of Ancient's Flame. But you, like I said, want a dagger for the close damage. So your other option is the Oculus. So this gives you bonus damage, evade charges, attacks reduce evade cooldown, and an insane amount of ranks to teleport. The Oculus obviously gives you more mobility and is my preference for cinder farming, whereas the other option will give you an extra aspect slot, which will allow you to use recharging on the ring instead of Ancient's Flame, which is obviously super helpful if you've got mana issues, as I mentioned. Lastly, if you're using the dagger and don't have any mana issues at all, then you would use something like the Aspect of Control instead of recharging on the ring. So last but not least, the focus. We're going to want a high item power as well as we want the high base damage per second. And the stats we're going to be looking for are critical strike chance, resource generation, cooldown reduction, and mana cost reduction. If you can't get those, then you would look for all stats and then intelligence. As for the aspect, we're going to be using conceded, so we deal 15 to 25% increased damage whilst we have a barrier active, which is almost all of the time. Now for the gems, we're going to be using the green ones for critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies in our offhand and main hand. In the armor, we're going to be using the rubies, red gems, for the maximum life. And in the jewelry here, we're going to be using the skulls for the armor. So that about wraps up the build. You should have more than enough survivability. As you can see, our armor and resistances are quite high, and you'll definitely have enough damage to clear everything in the game, no problem. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed or learned something from this video, please leave a like and subscribe, as it helps the channel a lot, and hit the bell too. Thanks again, and now here are a couple of tier 100s with the build in action. Bye!